In January of 2007, a man in a black turtleneck walked onto a stage in San Francisco and changed the course of modern technology forever. The audience had no idea what they were about to witness. At the time, the smartphone market already existed. Companies like Nokia, BlackBerry, Motorola, and Microsoft dominated the industry. Phones had buttons, keyboards, and small screens. They were practical tools designed mostly for emails, calls, and business communication. Nobody expected a computer company to reinvent the phone. But on that stage, Steve Jobs looked at the crowd and said something that sounded almost impossible. "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." The audience laughed. Some people clapped politely. Others were curious. But even then, nobody truly understood what was coming, because behind that moment was a story that almost nobody knew, a story of secret labs, internal conflicts, impossible deadlines, and a project so risky that it nearly destroyed the company that created it. This is the untold story of the first iPhone. To understand why the iPhone mattered so much, we need to go back to the early 2000s. At that time, mobile phones were already everywhere, but they were awkward devices. Most phones had tiny screens, physical keyboards, and complicated menus. Sending an email required navigating through endless buttons. Browsing the internet was slow and frustrating. Apps were almost non-existent. BlackBerry devices were especially popular among business professionals. Their keyboards made typing emails fast and efficient. Executives, politicians, and journalists relied on them. But outside the business world, phones were mostly used for calls and text messages. Apple, meanwhile, was experiencing a massive transformation. In 2001, the company released the iPod. The device quickly became a cultural phenomenon. It changed the way people listened to music and turned Apple into a consumer electronics powerhouse. But inside Apple, a dangerous realization was forming. Phones were starting to play music. If mobile phones eventually replaced music players, the iPod could become obsolete. And if the iPod died, Apple's entire business could collapse. So Apple faced a difficult choice. Either they ignore the threat and hope phones never catch up, or they build the future themselves. Steve Jobs chose the second option. Around 2004, Apple began exploring a secret project. It was so confidential that even many Apple employees had no idea it existed. The project had one goal: create a phone that was radically better than anything on the market. But the problem was enormous. Apple had never built a phone before. They had no experience with cellular networks, no expertise in antennas, no knowledge of carrier negotiations. And the phone industry was extremely complicated. Carriers controlled everything. They dictated software, features, and even design decisions. Most manufacturers had to obey their demands. Steve Jobs hated that idea. He believed Apple should control the entire product experience: hardware, software, design, user interface, everything. But convincing carriers to give up that control would be incredibly difficult. Still, Apple moved forward. Inside the company, the iPhone project was given a code name: Project Purple. The development team worked inside a secure building at Apple's headquarters. The doors required special access badges. The windows were covered. Employees working on the project were often forbidden from telling colleagues what they were doing. Some engineers even told their families they were working on completely different projects. Secrecy was critical, because if competitors discovered Apple's plan, they could try to copy it before launch. Inside the Project Purple building, hundreds of engineers worked day and night. The environment was intense, deadlines were aggressive, and the technology they were trying to build had never been attempted before. One of the biggest challenges was the touchscreen. At the time, most touchscreens required a stylus. They were inaccurate and slow. Steve Jobs hated styluses. He famously asked a simple question: who wants a stylus?
Instead, Apple wanted a touchscreen that could be controlled entirely with fingers, but not just one finger, multiple fingers at the same time, pinching, zooming, swiping, scrolling. The technology behind this concept was called multi-touch. It existed in research labs, but nobody had successfully implemented it in a mass-market device. Apple decided to try anyway. The engineering challenges were enormous. The screen needed to detect multiple finger inputs. The software had to interpret complex gestures. The interface had to feel natural and intuitive. Every interaction needed to respond instantly, because even a small delay would make the device feel broken. Engineers struggled for months. Prototypes failed constantly. Screens malfunctioned. Software crashed. Batteries drained too quickly. But slowly, progress began to appear. When the first working multi-touch prototype finally responded smoothly to finger gestures, something incredible happened. People couldn't stop playing with it. Scrolling through photos felt magical. Zooming into images with two fingers felt futuristic. Even simple actions like swiping across the screen felt completely new. And that moment convinced Apple that they were on to something revolutionary. But the touchscreen was only the beginning. The iPhone needed to combine multiple devices into one: a phone, a music player, an internet communicator. That meant building an entirely new operating system. Most phones at the time used clunky software designed for keyboards and buttons. Apple decided to adapt the operating system used on Mac computers. This decision was risky. A desktop operating system had never been used inside a mobile phone. The hardware limitations were severe. Processors were slow. Memory was limited. Battery life was fragile. But Apple believed the benefits were worth it. If they succeeded, the iPhone could run powerful software unlike any phone before it. Engineers spent years shrinking and optimizing the system. Every line of code had to be carefully rewritten. Performance had to remain fast. Power consumption had to stay low. And the interface had to feel effortless. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs was pushing the team relentlessly. He demanded perfection. If something didn't feel right, it was redesigned. If something felt complicated, it was simplified. If something looked ugly, it was rebuilt from scratch. Employees often described the process as exhausting, but it forced the team to achieve breakthroughs they never thought possible. Then another problem emerged: carriers. To launch a phone, Apple needed a partnership with a mobile carrier. Most carriers expected to control software and features, but Apple refused. Jobs wanted Apple to maintain full control over the device. That meant convincing a carrier to accept a completely new relationship. Eventually, Apple reached an agreement with AT&T. It was an unusual deal. Apple would design the entire experience. AT&T would simply provide network service. This level of control was almost unheard of in the phone industry, but it allowed Apple to deliver the product exactly as they imagined. After nearly 3 years of development, the iPhone was finally ready to be revealed. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto the stage at Macworld in San Francisco. The room was packed. Journalists, analysts, and technology enthusiasts filled every seat. Nobody knew exactly what Apple was about to announce. Jobs began his presentation calmly. He reminded the audience of Apple's history. Then he said something intriguing. "Today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products." The audience leaned forward. A widescreen iPod with touch controls. Applause. A revolutionary mobile phone. More applause. And a breakthrough internet communications device. The audience cheered. Jobs paused. Then he repeated the list: a widescreen iPod, a mobile phone, an internet communicator. Again and again. Suddenly, he smiled. "Today, these are not 3 separate devices." He paused for dramatic effect. "This is one device." And the audience erupted. The iPhone had arrived. The demonstration that followed became one of the most famous product launches in history. Jobs showed how users could scroll through music with their fingers,
Zoom into photos, browse full websites, watch videos, and make calls. Every gesture looked smooth and effortless. The audience gasped repeatedly because nothing like it had ever existed. But what the audience didn't know was how fragile that demonstration actually was. Behind the scenes, the iPhone prototypes were still unstable. If certain features were used out of order, the device could crash. Engineers created a carefully planned sequence of actions for the presentation. Jobs had to follow it exactly. If he opened the wrong app too early or loaded the wrong website, the phone might freeze in front of the entire audience. The pressure was enormous, but Jobs delivered the presentation flawlessly. The world instantly took notice. Within hours, news headlines around the globe were talking about Apple's revolutionary phone. But not everyone was impressed. Some competitors dismissed the device. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer famously laughed at the idea that the iPhone could compete with business phones. Others criticized the high price. The first iPhone launched at $499 and $599, depending on storage. For many consumers, that seemed extremely expensive, but Apple believed the experience justified the price. When the iPhone finally launched on June 29, 2007, something remarkable happened. People lined up outside Apple stores for hours, sometimes overnight. They wanted to be among the first to own the future. And once people started using the device, it became clear that something profound had changed. The touchscreen made navigation effortless. The web browser felt like a real computer experience. Photos, music, and videos all lived inside a single device. Suddenly, the phone wasn't just a phone anymore, it was a pocket computer. And over time, the impact became even bigger. Developers began creating mobile applications. Entire industries formed around mobile software. Ride-sharing, mobile gaming, food delivery, social media, navigation, photography, streaming, banking, all powered by the device that began as Apple's secret experiment. The iPhone didn't just disrupt the phone industry, it reshaped everyday life. Today, billions of people carry smartphones. But that transformation started with a risky project inside a locked building at Apple. A project that many people thought would fail. A project that required thousands of hours of engineering, design, and experimentation. And a project driven by one powerful belief. Technology should feel simple, beautiful, and human. Looking back, the first iPhone was more than just a product. It was a turning point, a moment when technology became something we touched, swiped, and interacted with directly. The device changed how we communicate, how we work, how we navigate the world, and even how we think about technology itself. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the story is this. When Steve Jobs stood on that stage in 2007, even Apple didn't fully understand the scale of what they had created. They thought they were reinventing the phone. In reality, they were reinventing the future. If you enjoy business stories, brand documentaries, and the strategies behind global companies, subscribe to Brand Story Lab, because the next story might completely change how you see the brands around you, and maybe even inspire the brand you build someday.